This mind map shows the major dimensions of the approach known as communicative language teaching, or CLT. Let's begin with the real-life version of communication that underlies this whole thing. Here it's represented in 4 simple parts. For real, genuine communication to take place between 2 people, A and B, we need the condition that A knows something, which B does not. Secondly, that A can express that idea or piece of information in the target language and B can understand it. Thirdly, that A wants to give this information to B and that B wants to hear it. And finally, and possibly most challenging, that there's nothing more interesting to do at the time. My position is that anytime we violate any of these conditions, then the interaction will be less than fully communicative. Let's go to some background. Before CLT took over, as it were, one of the dominant methodologies was audiolingual, and what was happening in the audiolingual approach, particularly in the United Kingdom, was a localized version of it, which is better known as structural situational methodology. But one of the things that it led to was the idea of graded practice. ALM was particularly well known for drills, and drills are very controlled. And what people were trying to do was to add on the end of a particular unit, getting away from the controlled drills and giving the students relative freedom so that they could actually develop some fluency. And it was this idea of fluency, of students being able to come up with utterances by themselves, that contributed to communicative language teaching. Secondly, in the 1970s as well, when this CLT was really emerging, was a time of humanistic ideas moving through language education and finding different forms of expression. The most important for these purposes is the idea of personalized practice, that students should be able to talk about themselves and their own lives and interests rather than simply mimicking things from their textbook about fictional characters. Related to that is this movement away from fictional material. So textbooks up to that point featured dialogues between made-up people. The dialogues were written by textbook writers who, frankly, were often not very good at writing the way people actually speak. And the reading texts were also inauthentic and somewhat bogus. But what was happening was that that kind of fictional material was being set aside, and we were moving to the real world and saying that nonfiction materials were actually always going to be more interesting and engaging. And that led to starting to use things like maps and charts and graphs and diagrams to represent information for students to practice forming language to express the information that they saw in those kinds of things. And that eventually led to content-based instruction, which is when a language class is not directly based on language but uses the target language to teach a particular subject like history or psychology or some aspect of science or technology. Also going on at the time when CLT was emerging was the emergence of sociolinguistics as an important part of the linguistics field. Sociolinguistics had existed a little bit in the past, but it was really at the border of linguistics and anthropology, and the focus was very much on the way language was used but in other speech communities. So anthropologists or linguistic anthropologists or anthropological linguists would go off to look at other societies just as the tradition required in anthropology. So sociolinguistics emerged as a field and immediately started to produce concepts and ideas and data that were of great interest to applied linguists. So that, for example, the idea of a speech event gave us a framework to work with in the classroom and led to a much increased use of role plays, for example, where we would know how to set the students up as two different people or three different people within a particular context and give them an idea of what the speech event was supposed to achieve. Also coming out of sociolinguistics was the notion of communicative competence, so extending the idea beyond grammatical competence, that not only as a proficient speaker of another language could you form native-like utterances, but you knew how to use which particular utterance in which particular context with which particular interlocutors. Also emerging and strengthening at this time was the field of second language acquisition, which had moved way beyond the old behaviorist ideas of language as a set of habits that could be developed by a lot of repetition. And one of the things that SLA theory started to talk about was the importance of the negotiation of meaning, that learners could collectively produce output and work together in small groups in order to find their way to solving a problem or achieving a task or whatever it may be. And this led to the idea of communicative tasks, which would cause students to have to negotiate meaning. At the same time, a lot of students from developing countries, particularly, but also from pretty much anywhere, students were starting to show up in college-level programs in the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and so on. And so the whole idea of language for specific purposes really began as English for academic purposes, but quickly spread to English for other kinds of purposes. We have English for occupational purposes, for example, something called EBE, English for Business and Economics, and it also spread to other languages. So you have Spanish for medical purposes, for example, Chinese for business purposes. And this led to the idea of needs assessment, that what we needed to do in the language classroom would be based not on what we, in a more abstract way, knew about the target language, but based on what this particular group of students needed to do with the target language in the future, in what contexts, at what level, and so forth. This again led to the notion of content-based instruction. So if we're dealing with a group of engineers, that we would actually be teaching them in the language classroom some not high level, very technical science or technology, but something that would get them into that discourse and get them familiar with the vocabulary and the discourse structures and so on. And of course that required the use of authentic materials, which matches the moving away from fictional material. Discourse analysis emerged in linguistics. Linguistics had been very absorbed at the sentence level for a long time, and really through the work of Chomsky and transformational generative grammar, the 50s, 60s, and early 70s were very sentence level based, but because of sociolinguistics and because of specific purpose requirements, we had to start looking at speech events and the structure of things like lectures, for example, or office visits with an instructor, and various kinds of written texts, and looking at the way sentences and paragraphs were put together to make a discourse, and then break that down so that students could grasp it and use it themselves. The final dimension here is a contribution from the philosophy of language. The philosophy of language has been around for a long time, but in the 20th century had wandered into various cul-de-sacs and kind of got stuck. But in the late 50s and the early 60s, there emerged a group of philosophers who were interested in the way that language was used in real life. Ludwig Wittgenstein really drove the beginning of that. And it came out very strongly in, for example, a book by John Austin published in around 1960 called How to Do Things with Words. And they came up with the idea of speech acts, which is that we can label an utterance not only by its grammatical nature, but also by according to the purpose of the speaker, so that something is a greeting or a request or an act of persuasion. And speech acts is used in the philosophy of language. When that idea was moved into applied linguistics, we started calling them functions. And so there is a type of language syllabus that we look at in the curriculum design course called the functional syllabus. And that is an adaptation of this idea from the philosophy of language. So that's CLT, communicative language teaching, a varied background bringing together ideas from different parts of linguistics, psycholinguistics, the philosophy of language, developments in education in general, such as the humanistic approach, and basically a movement in which we might call realism, away from having students mess around with made-up fictional characters and really use the target language to deal with the real world. CLT, the great revolution of the latter part of the 20th century.